I was actually hiding under my desk to see if you guys got it. I actually taught with a different version of this background for my entire abnormal class, and no one said anything about it. So, you know, I don't know if they just hadn't seen it or if they're just quieter than y'all, but yeah. I'm here live. I'm not a cat. Yeah, for those of you who may not have seen the news article, there was a lawyer who, and I have the whole Zoom that you can see here, who signed into Zoom for a court hearing like this with this old, apparently Dell webcam filter that his kids had put on. So they couldn't turn it off like a normal Zoom filter. So, and one of the things he says is, I'm live here. I'm not a cat. So I've been doing a little Dr. Martorell today for those of you who have had her and having a fun background. Actually, my hair is kind of tame today, so it's not too bad with the pixelation either. So here, I'll put the cat back on. I like just the cat better. This one in particular, where the cat's like looking to the side. I love that. It's just like, I'm here live. I'm not a cat. The judge is like, I know that. It's great. Okay, so we're missing quite a few people still, but I'm going to take attendance from those who are here. And then after that, we will get into groups. So hopefully during the time I take attendance, more people will log on so that we can do that. So I appreciate y'all getting the joke, basically. It's like I said, I taught my entire abnormal class with that background and no one said anything. And I was like, all right, well, I'm just going to roll with it then. So for those who are just rolling in, I am taking attendance. Again, I'm just doing this to keep track of who I don't see for a little bit. And I know a couple of you have already gotten like, are you okay? Emails from me. Again, it's not supposed to be any kind of accusation. It's literally just, are you okay? Do you need medical attention? That type of thing. So please don't ever think I'm judging you about that. Okay. So today, if you remember back to Tuesday, sometimes it feels like a really long time ago, right? Still, we're in this COVID time. But what we're going to do is we are going to do a group activity. And I just realized I don't have the link. So let me grab it real quick. It'll only take me a second of clicks here. Okay. So each group is going to be assigned a theory of crime from your book. So hopefully y'all have your books, or at least one person in each group will have your books. And like our past ones, it's one big document and then each group has an assignment sheet. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw the link in the chat. All right, so make sure that you get that, and I'm gonna work on setting up the groups here. And so there are questions that ask you basic things. And remember, we're using the pilot episode of Dexter. If you weren't here on Tuesday, either ask your classmates to explain it to you, or I'm sure if you like go to YouTube real quick, there's probably a trailer that explains everything. But essentially, he's a really good example of someone with psychopathic tendencies, or what in psychology we might call antisocial personality disorder, which we'll break down in a lot of detail after y'all do the assignment. So I'm going to set up the breakout rooms here, 5 groups, one for each sort of category of theories. So some of your theories might have a couple sub-theories in your section. You can sort of decide which is most helpful to explaining Dexter. And each room should have 4 people. And I've got them set up for 20 minutes, and then you'll get your 60-second countdown after that. So again, pay attention to which Zoom room you're assigned to. Find that group number on the Google Doc. Make sure you grab the Google Doc link in the chat right now, and then answer the questions using those theories. And if anyone needs anything, you can use the little help button. There we go. Alrighty, so hopefully that was enlightening and helpful to, I think that's a lot more interesting than just sort of like a dry lecture about these types of theories. Hopefully you all agreed. I'm gonna go ahead and call on each group to just walk us briefly through everything. You don't have to give a lot of detail for everything, but you know, the whole assignment essentially. And I will actually go ahead and screen share it so everyone can see without having to try to have Zoom and other stuff up at the same time, particularly if you're on your phone. I did an hour-and-a-half long meeting just on my phone the other day, and I have like so much empathy for those of you who use your phones for everything. Like, I don't know how you do it and not go insane. So my heart goes out to you. But all right, let's start with group 1, which was Naila, Stephen, Aaron, Sherelle, and Kaylee Sue. So tell us about sociological theories and how they would explain Dexter.
I can take the first one. So the first question was name and give a brief description of your group's assigned theory. And we had sociological theories, which is divided into 2 separate parts: structural, which emphasizes dysfunctional social arrangements, and subcultural, which emphasizes the conflict between different groups.
Okay. Sorry, I was on mute. I thought you could hear me. So I'll take the second question. I'm Naila. How would your group's theory explain Dexter's criminal behavior? Whoa, what happened? What's going on? Did the thing move? Okay. We said that,
and I like did too much zooming.
oh, it's okay. We said that subcultural theory would explain it because Dexter thinks that he's a better person and he's in a different group with the criminals. The only conflict is that he's murdering them. So he thinks that he's, doing good because he's getting rid of his urges while also getting rid of bad people in the community. So he thinks that he's kind of like Robin Hooding, and he feels good about it. But it's the fact that you even have the urge to kill people at all that's not normal. And that's the second question.
I can do the third. Okay, how will your group's theory explain how Dexter interacts with his friends and family? We say he tries to fit into the structure of his society by following the social norms of his friends and family. His lack of feelings is a social disadvantage, which is explained through structural explanation.
The next question is, what would your group's theory say about Dexter's psychological state? He tries to satisfy social norms But I feel like his psychological state is probably not solid. It's probably a little off. And then, do you agree with how your group's theory explains Dexter? Why or why not? And we say we agree that it fits his description because I forgot why we said we agreed, but we did agree that we felt that it best suited Dexter's personality.
We had trouble putting it into words for why it fits, but if you look at the episode over again, you can see him trying to fit in without like making anything known of what he's doing outside of work.
Yeah, he'll do things like bring people donuts. 'Cause that's what you do.
Yes. And then he got the girlfriend because it was just it just made everything look normal. And he got a girlfriend that wasn't really, I guess, like a touchy kind of person, just so he could just have the picturesque idea of a relationship.
Yeah, he thought he was safe, right? And then at the end, when she was like, "Oh, I think I'm ready," he's like, "Oh no, what do I do?" Alrighty, well, great job, Group 1. And we will move on to Group 2 to talk about biological theories. So we have Jordan, Carly, Lilia, Kristen, and Emily.
So we kind of just defined the biological theories as like a search for genetic, neuro, and chemical irregularities that predispose people to criminal behavior. So this theory would explain Dexter by saying he has like neuropsychological abnormalities because he's kind of like addicted to this murder, and he has this like innate trait to like kill bad guys, but he also has the ability to like control it enough and reserve himself. And then since we don't really know much about his original parents, because the parents in there were like his foster parents, I think, we didn't really want to make any assumptions about like genetic vulnerabilities because we don't really know what his parents were like. I don't know if
I
anybody
can
else
do
wants
the
to-
rest.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do some other. So for how the group's theories explain how dinner expresses his family, friends and family. So since he has a neuropsychological abnormality, he hasn't developed like parts of like normal sociability, which inhibits him from being able to empathize with others and show proper emotions, which prohibits him from having like normal social interactions. I mean, even though he like tries to, as you guys said in the first group, because he thinks that's like the normal way to hide it, but it's just still not normal, like in other people's eyes, I guess you'd say. And then what will your group's theory say about Dexter's psychological state? We said that it's due to the neurological abnormality in his brain, that it gives him the ability to murder without remorse, but be able to have as much control in his urges to think enough through the scenarios and outcomes of how he's going to murder each person. Does anyone else want to do the last?
I can go again. We did agree that the biological approach could like be a feasible explanation for Dexter's behavior, just because we don't really know much about like how he was raised or like growing up and stuff like that, or like his birth parents and everything. We also were kind of looking at the other definitions, and we thought the psychological approach could also be viable, just because like it's part of his personality and like kind of his development and everything. So.
I did have one question though, when we were like looking at the definition of biological and it talks about like chemical irregularities, what would be considered chemical?
Oh, good question. So things like neurotransmitters.
Okay, because genetic is like, we all know what genetic, and neuro is like pretty much is the brain processing chemical, like how it works.
Yeah.
But that's why I was like, what would be considered chemical if neuros kind of involves chemical, like
Yeah, it is sort of neuro, and there is like neurochemistry, for example. But yeah, your like your serotonin levels might be different. It might take you more serotonin to get to,
like so actual chemicals within your brain. Okay.
but it could also be related to like substance use and things like that too. But that's a really good question, Jordan. And as you all were talking, for some reason you made me remember 2 books about psychopaths that might be pretty interesting. The first one's pretty obvious because it's talking about a neuroscientist trying to figure out psychopathology. And then the second one's really interesting. It's called The Psychopath Test. And it's like this journalist who's basically trying to figure out what psychopaths are and like finds out he might have it and whatnot. So if this topic is particularly interesting to you, these are 2 really interesting views of it from a more biological perspective. Awesome. Thanks, group 2. That's sometimes the hardest one to describe, and y'all did great. Alrighty, group 3, you have the psychological ones. So we have Michaela, Tacey, CJ, Savaja, the 4 of you. Okay.
So the first question is name and give a brief definition of your group's assigned theory, and ours was psychological theories of crime, which are individual differences in the way people think or feel about their behavior. And so my computer second.
For the second question, for the second question, it talked about his behavior, and we said his behavior was very careful and observing of others, such as the murderer he was trying to catch. His behavior started at a very young age, as most serial killers do, but he thinks it's more justified for him to do these things due to his father trying to help him channel his urges towards people who deserve it, where legal actions failed.
So the third question was about how he interacts with his family and friends, and how's our theory explain that. We said that he was very good at mimicking emotions, and he doesn't come across as too socially awkward. When he was playing with the kids, for example, it was seemed very natural, and same with interacting with his sister. It also was apparent that he had a very close relationship with his father because of how he was able to help him redirect his urges towards criminals. And then, however, when his girlfriend tried to make a sexual advance on him, he wasn't quite sure how to handle that situation. So basically, he struggles with interpersonal relationships.
Theory, like if it were explaining Dexter's psychological state, it says that he has psychopathic tendencies, like that he would lack emotion, he doesn't he's not loyal to others. Let's see, let me read the other parts. Don't stare at me. Sorry, there's people talking behind me.
Muted, but I said all good.
Okay. I know it also stated that that people with these like psychopathic tendencies lack control of their own actions, but I don't agree with that because he seemed to be in control of almost everything he was doing. Although he does like lack empathy, I guess, and shows no remorse, he isn't irresponsible or arrogant. So I don't think he fits the criteria as much as, like, there are parts that shows that he does, but not 100%.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And after we get through all the groups, we'll actually go over the criteria. And one of the important things about any disorder we're diagnosing is you don't have to meet every criteria to get diagnosed. And, you know, it's also hard with just one episode of the show, right? Because for those of you who've seen the show later in the show, he kind of loses control at certain points. And he talks about it being his dark passenger, his urge that, like, he can only control because he channels it. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that a lot of psychopaths, actually, especially serial killers, are very ritualistic, are very cautious, right? Can just sort of get away with things. So I think that that's a really good point, that they don't all have that sort of like impulsivity, yeah. Right?
It also talked about having an executive function, which is the ability to plan and regulate behavior, which he seemed to be like plan everything out perfectly, and like how like to clean up, be careful, and all that stuff. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. The executive function is the CEO of the brain. It lives here in your prefrontal cortex. And yeah, you need it to be able to do the simplest things like put your socks on before your shoes, but also to do things like plan how to clean a crime. And it's unclear how much of that he would have just figured out and how much of it was because his foster father taught him how to do this. But yeah, that's a really good point too, right? And again, he's not alone in that in terms of if we think of serial killers, right? They can only be serial killers because they are careful, right? And they don't get caught. So I think that that's a really good point about psychopathy. Alrighty, great job, group 3. Moving on to group 4. Alrighty, so here we have Casita, India, Greta, and Annika.
So we said the social psychological theories are a group of theories that propose that crime is learned in a social context, and they differ about what is learned and how it's learned. And so basically, like, we described like Dexter's crime behaviors that like he would come up with like rational excuses like to his own belief. And I forgot what the guy's name was, but he would always do it to buy this guy's code. So like how he was taught to go out with these criminal behaviors, that he made it seem like it was okay that he was doing it, even though like he wasn't. Code of Harry, that's what it was. So like basically he was taught like that it's okay that you're like channeling like these urges as long as the person deserves it, is how he made it seem like it was rational. Does anyone else want to go next?
I said that Dexter kind of had psychopathic tendencies. He could be very much categorized as a psychopath. He didn't really have emotions as you and I do. He more so emulated them. He was very calculated. And like it was just said, a lot of his morals were taught to him more so than gained of his own accord. Whoever can go next.
I can finish it. So basically, like we agreed. Oh, do you agree with how your group's theories explain Dexter? And we thought that it did because he does show his psychopathic tendencies. And like what you said, you don't need to like fit all the criteria to be diagnosed. But he fits most of the criteria. So he could be diagnosed as a psychopath because he's mirroring these tendencies and he's carrying them out, and he doesn't seem anything like wrong with it, and he has these urges that sometimes are uncontrollable.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that your group's theory raises is something that's I wouldn't say it's like a debate, but it's sort of interesting within the psychological community. So psychopath or psychopathy tends to be the term we use to express the overall personality trait. But some people will make a distinction between psychopaths, and I'll put this in the chat, versus sociopaths. And the idea behind that is that psychopaths have something genetic or biological that creates them that way, and then sociopaths, there is something that happens to them in their life that makes them this way. That doesn't really explain, you know, what if they have both, right? And also just diagnostically, we don't make a distinction. Instead, we talk about, and again, we're going to talk about this once we've been through all the theories, but antisocial personality disorder. That's actually the diagnosis we would give someone who was either a psychopath or a sociopath. But it is something interesting to think about of like, does it make a distinction? And some psychologists argue that there are distinctions, and some argue that it doesn't matter. So again, to show you all that like science is an evolving process and we're not all in agreement about this yet. Alrighty, so our last group looked at the integration of all the theories, and it was Jackie, Kenzie, Hayden, and Alexis.
Yeah, so pretty much it's the catch-all of all categories pretty much, saying that there's no single variable or no single cause to any psychopath or sociopath's criminal activities, so to speak. It primarily looks at how there's 4 contributing factors. There's going to be the antecedent conditions, the early indicators, the developmental processes, and the maintenance factors, all of which pretty much take a little bit of every other category and every other theory and contributes it somehow to their behavior. But kind of just looking at how his criminal behavior was affected, you can see how like the antecedent conditions, him being a foster child growing up and then finally finding a family, and that all plays into it somehow. We don't know what the biological factors that his real parents had. Early indicators, of course, they knew he was aggressive. His father kind of gave into it and he taught him how to continue being aggressive to kind of stop criminals later on in life, which kind of shows like a mixture of the early indicator and the developmental processes, because his father was the one kind of contributing to these factors then. And then the maintenance of factors, of course, his father is saying, I'm going to reinforce these behaviors and keep you going on this path so that later in life, you can get the bad guys off the street, just not how it should be done, so to speak. So anyone else want to go?
The theory explains his interaction with his family and friends based off of the early indicators of developmental process, kind of like what she said. He has a close relationship with his father. His father was the one who kind of took his violent behavior and basically, taught him how, to use it based off of killing people who are criminals and who is considered bad. And then his sister is a cop as well, and they actually work together, and he associates himself with non-deviant and non-aggressive people, with an example of his girlfriend actually being a victim of sexual assault from her former boyfriend.
Yeah, and then just kind of giving into the psychological state that he's in. It's kind of like you said earlier, he's going out and he's giving donuts to people that he knows, and he's kind of putting on a facade for other people to see because he doesn't really want to show them his true face, so to speak. He doesn't and that's all psychopaths. So they want to put on this kind of face and say, this is who I want you to see me as, and that kind of contributes to the psychological state that he's in, is just he's not really himself, so to speak. He's this person, then he's this person, then he's this person, which again takes a little bit of every theory. And then for the last one, where we kind of all, again, we were all having Wi-Fi issues, but we all kind of just agreed that I think it was good to have the catch-all category where you get a little bit of each theory in there. Like you get the biological factors, the psychological factors, the sociological factors, and they all kind of play a role into who he is as a person and who he is as a serial killer, so to speak. So I think we all agreed pretty much. I hope so.
Thanks, Jackie, for taking over since you're apparently the only one without Wi-Fi issues right now. Yeah, as I said in the chat, this is, I had this problem in my intro class last semester too, where this 1 to 2:15 time, whether it's Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Thursday, it's sort of an ideal time to fit classes in. And because of that, everybody uses them, right? And so it can actually make things pretty tricky in terms of Wi-Fi connectivity. So sometimes my intro students last semester couldn't even hear me. So that's another reason why I always make sure I record and post. But yeah, great job to all the groups kind of working through Dexter, trying to figure him out. I'm not going to give too many spoilers just because I know that sometimes people go down the rabbit hole and binge all of Dexter after this. So I don't want to, give too much away, but what you do find out later in the show is that Dexter did experience a tragic event, a very traumatic event, in fact. And that's actually how he meets his foster father, Harry, as Harry is the police officer who's at the scene of the crime. And you also find out later that his brother is also a serial killer. So, again, that suggests, was it because they were both at this traumatic event, or was there some genetic issue? right? Not as clear, but it's certainly very complex. And I don't think it gives too much of a spoiler to say like his and Rita's relationship does grow and change. So he grows and changes throughout the show, depending on who he's interacting with, honestly. So awesome job. And I do have, like I said, a little bit of fill in for more about psychopathy and things along those lines. I'm going to sit instead of stand today just because it's a little more casual. Oh, sure. Right as soon as I want to put out my notebook. Hello. Are you jealous of the other cat on the screen? Okay. He's going to go in and out because it doesn't know what to do with two faces, especially one is an actual cat. So let me get the PowerPoint set up. I have to kind of look around Simba here. Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. You can go sleep on your IKEA chair. Like we have a poong and it's really his poong at this point in time. So, okay. So if you want like more detail about the terminology or anything for any of these theories of crime, you certainly can look at this in more detail. But I'm going to do just a little bit more on the historical views. And then, like I said, we're going to focus a lot on the what is antisocial personality, what is psychopathy, what is sociopathy. So historical views of crime, most ancient explanations took a religious tone. So crime was sin or crime was equivalent to sin, and so you should punish it that way. So there was a classical school of criminology, and it emphasized free will to explain criminal conduct. So essentially, everyone has free will, so these people are choosing to engage in this crime. And so they thought that the punishment should fit the crime. The positivist school of criminology emphasized factors believed to determine criminal behavior. So basically a lot of what you all just talked through. So the sociological, the biological, psychological, environmental. And they used the scientific method and the analysis of empirical data. However, their empirical data wasn't always great. So some of the positivist criminologists were into, for example, phrenology, which if you don't know what that is, there was this idea that applied to psychology too, that they thought by like studying the bumps on your head, they could determine a lot about your personality. Not a thing, right? But back then they thought it was. So, and then they thought the punishment should fit the criminal, not the crime. And so this wasn't quite rehabilitative corrections yet, but it sort of foreshadows the idea that we might try to rehabilitate the criminal rather than just punish them. All right, so I'm gonna skip through all these because y'all did a great job and talk about antisocial personality disorder. Again, sometimes they're described as either psychopaths or sociopaths. And people with antisocial personality disorder persistently disregard and violate others' rights. So, aside from substance-related disorder, this is the disorder most linked to adult criminal behavior. And it is, how do I describe this? It is, I don't want to like, I feel like problematic is not a stern enough term, right? But certainly it is something that, one of the best descriptions I've heard of it is it's not something you suffer from. It's something that if you have it, kind of like Dexter, you might recognize you're different from other people, but you don't necessarily think that you're broken or something in some way. You're just sort of like, this is how I am. And as one of the groups pointed out, it almost makes you feel better than other people, right? Like he kind of sees himself as like a superhero, right? Since he's out there killing other criminals. So most people who have antisocial PD have been displaying these behaviors since well before they're 15, but it has to occur at least since the age of 15. As you saw in Dexter, he started when he was a kid killing animals. That is unfortunately not uncommon So, again, poor animals. But like Harry, some people are like, well, at least it's not people. But it's obviously problematic in its own way. So you have to be 18 years old to actually be diagnosed with this. You'll see this down in criterion B down here. And that is because this is true of actually any personality disorder. In the teen years, because of hormonal changes and social changes, how difficult middle school and high school are just in general, right? We can see behavior that looks like a number of personality disorders, but that will essentially fade as soon as that person reaches adulthood and kind of figures out life, right? And so we don't want to pathologize someone for what might be, again, not totally normal behavior, but other things. There is a sort of stopgap, not really, but there is a diagnosis you can give someone with antisocial PD when they are younger than 18, and that is down here, conduct disorder. So conduct disorder onsets before age 15 and has a lot of similar symptoms. So you're not branding them with this antisocial personality disorder at such a young age, but you are acknowledging that this isn't healthy, right? So in terms of the actual criteria, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have 3 or more, and there are 7, right? So you don't have to meet all 7 of these to be diagnosed. So failure to conform to social norms, particularly with respect to lawful behaviors, and they will perform crimes. We have to make things sound really technical. Perform acts that are grounds for arrest. They're criminals, right? They have deceitfulness. So they'll lie, they'll use aliases, they'll con others for profit or pleasure. And this is why, actually it talks about this in the psychopath test, that some people believe that, these guys on Wall Street that caused the housing bubble and just sort of gamble with other people's lives, some of them may fit criteria for this disorder, right? And that's one way I've heard this described as like, where are they all? Like the good ones get away with it, and are these CEOs that profit off other people's suffering? Again, I don't know those people. I can't diagnose them, but it's certainly an interesting theory. Impulsivity is the one we talked about already, right? Dexter isn't really showing that, and it's unclear whether he would have never shown it or if it's because Harry sort of trained it out of him. Even when he talks about killing animals when he was a kid, he talks about like killing the dog that's keeping his mom up while she's sick, his foster mom, right? Irritability and aggressiveness. So physical fights or assaults, and it doesn't have to be bar fights, right? It can be sort of more calculated, as we see with Dexter. Reckless disregard for their own safety or the safety of others, right? So like Dexter works at a police station, right? And only that one guy, Dokes, right, gets some weird vibes from him. But it's pretty risky to work at a police station if you are a serial killer, right? Consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or other financial obligations. Again, Dexter doesn't really show this one, right? He's holding a steady job, but there are people who would with this disorder. Lack of remorse, being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another, including maybe stolen their life, right? Yeah, Dexter doesn't really have remorse about killing these guys, and as some of the groups mentioned, he sort of justifies it that they're criminals, right? But Harry's idea, Harry, Dexter's foster father, was, there are people who are getting away with stuff, and so I'll like channel Dexter's urges for good, right? But that's not actually how our justice system is supposed to work, right? That's one of the biggest problems with these acts of police brutality that we see, is like, even if, which in a lot of cases they are not, right? But even if that person is a criminal, you do not have a right to execute them without a trial, right? And that's what Dexter's doing. Or maybe sometimes they had a trial and it didn't go the way he wanted. That's still not how our justice system is supposed to work, right? Also, they point out that it can't just be like part of your psychosis and schizophrenia or part of a manic episode in bipolar disorder. Okay. Quick lesson in psychology politics. Yes, there are politics in psychology. And those of you who took Theories of Personality with me last semester are very familiar with this. So the book that we use to diagnose people is called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I don't know why we don't call it the DSM-MD, but we just call it the DSM. So when they revised it back in 2013, they had working groups to work on each set of disorders and say like what problems were in the current version, which was created in 2000. And the personality disorder working group realized that the personality disorders don't actually work that well. There's something on the order of 60% of people who are diagnosed with a personality disorder who don't actually fit criteria for just one or fit criteria for multiple personality disorders, or only like kind of meet criteria, but that's certainly a problem in personality. So they proposed an entirely new system based on lots of feedback from clinicians, lots of research. And I remember I went to my big conference in November of 2012, and I went to a panel by these people, and I thought, oh, this is going to be so interesting. They're going to explain the new diagnoses. And it was like the most defeated I've ever seen someone in a panel. And they explained to us they had just presented this to the editors of the DSM. And the editor said, this is great, but we think this is too late for our May publication date. So we're just going to copy paste the existing personality disorder diagnoses, which we know are problematic. So this one we just look at, right? This is copy pasted from that 2000 version. And then we'll take these, your new ones, and we'll put them in the back as an appendix. So like they could fit them in before the publishing deadline, but yet it's weird, it's stupid, right? It shows you the politics. The DSM is run by psychiatrists. It's run by the American Psychiatric Association. The American Psychological Association has a lot of issues at times with how the DSM is constructed. This was a clear example of that because it was mostly psychologists who were working on this, not psychiatrists. So, boil it down, this is probably what will be in the DSM-6 as the definition of antisocial PD. And so here you can see now we're being more specific. So you have to have impairment to for two of these. So impairment to identity, impairment to self-direction, impairment to empathy, and or impairment to intimacy. And as we can see, like Dexter, I would say is the last two, but certainly some might argue for elements of the first two as well, right? And then you have 6 or more of the following. So these are, I think, more similar to the current criteria. So callousness is the, I'll start with manipulativeness. Manipulativeness is using cunning, craft, or subterfuge to influence or control others. Casual use of others to one's own advantage. Use of seduction, charm, glibness, or ingratiation to achieve one's own end. And this is a really important point that I feel like the current diagnosis kind of misses, is this this mask that Dexter wears, right? That you see most psychopaths do that, where they can put on this like, I'm the happy guy who brings donuts, and aren't I charming, right? This like mask of charm. So I like that that's in there. Then callousness is lack of empathy or concern for others' feelings or problems, the lack of guilt or remorse that already exists, and actually even exploiting other people. Deceitfulness is dishonesty, untruthfulness, embellishment or fabrication when relating events, misrepresentation of yourself, fraudulence, hostility, irritability, hot-temperedness, being unfriendly, rude, surly, or nasty, might respond angrily to minor slights and insults. Risk-taking, also sometimes called recklessness, is craving and pursuit of stimulation and variety without regard for consequences. And this gets at, again, more of that maybe even biologically based idea that they might need more stimulation, like higher levels of stimulation to get to the same level of enjoyment you and I might get by like watching Netflix, right? They might need to be doing something really out there to get that same level of enjoyment. So they're prone to boredom. They'll initiate activities to counter boredom. They'll take unnecessary risks. They'll have a lack of concern for their own limitations. They'll deny the reality of the personal danger and have a high tolerance for uncertainty and unfamiliarity. Impulsivity is exactly what we think of, acting on the spur of the moment. Again, something we don't see as much in Dexter. And then irresponsibility, we just went over, but there's also sort of like a recklessness element to that. And then they're going to have a specifier with psychopathic features, or people who have all that and then also are low in anxiousness. So this is one of the hallmarks of people who are psychopaths, is like they can do all these things and never worry about it. Like if you or I'm just sort of assuming, I don't have any psychopaths in this class, but if you or I were to plan and commit a crime, we would be so anxious before we did it, right? And we just wouldn't see that. Let me see. Some other quick things to go over about antisocial PD. They tend to be really intelligent, but lacking in judgment sometimes. That charm has sometimes been called the mask of sanity. They tend to be likable, spontaneous, humorous, upbeat, optimistic, and then, again, only show their true colors later on. They have that inadequate conscience. That lack of anticipatory anxiety or remorse or guilt makes these types of things easier for them to do than it would be for one of us. They reject authority. And another thing is they're unable to profit from experience, right? So they don't learn from their mistakes. This is why treating them is really, really hard, because they don't think they've made mistakes. They don't think there's anything wrong with what they've done. They often have an inability to maintain interpersonal relationships. So like they've been called interpersonally delayed, like they just struggle with that. So they can have the charm, but it's harder for them to be in that deeper. And you kind of see that in his relationship with Rita, right, in the episode. As I mentioned, they have this disorder. They don't really suffer from it. Other case examples would be Anthony Hopkins' character, plus the other guy in Silence of the Lambs, right? The put the lotion in the basket guy. Matt Damon in The Talented Mr. Ripley. Things along those lines. And like I said, treatment, nothing really seems to work. The worst idea ever is to try to do group therapy with them, because they just give each other ideas. About 80% of psychopaths are men. But most people who are in prison are not psychopaths. So that's something I want to put out there. Women can and do exhibit psychopathic behavior. We just don't always recognize it for what it is. Women tend to engage more in what's called relational aggression. So I'm going to throw that term up here. And the best example ever of relational aggression is the movie Mean Girls. An entire movie is relational aggression. The burn book, everything. Okay? So girls and women may have antisocial PD, but they're not out killing people. They're maybe killing people's reputations and things along those lines. The hair PCL and the PCLR are two well-established, well-researched questionnaires, checklists actually for the PCLR, that help you to diagnose someone with this disorder. And as you saw with looking at our theories, we don't really have one good theory about what causes this. Some people think that there's some sort of left hemisphere frontal lobe deficiency that impairs that executive functioning that our bio group talked about. Stimulation seeking theory, which was from the 60s, claims that the thrill of seeking and disruptive behavior of the psychopath increases sensory input to a more tolerable level. And in fact, the really interesting thing to me watching Dexter again is like, he almost feels like someone on the autism spectrum, right? Like there's a lot of similarities. And one of the things we talk about in autism spectrum disorder individuals is a lack of what's called theory of mind. It's essentially a fancy word for empathy or being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? We also see people with schizophrenia struggle with that. And I think we see that in psychopaths, at least the way you see Dexter portrayed, right? Like he doesn't understand when Rita's telling him things, right? Like how he should appropriately respond. So it's just sort of interesting to think about that. And certainly people with autism are not this. It's very rare for someone with autism to harm someone else. They're actually, unfortunately, more likely to self-harm. But it is, again, not rare for someone with this disorder to do so. And as I mentioned before, in terms of thinking about psychopaths versus sociopaths, there are no diagnostic differences. Everyone would just be diagnosed with antisocial PD. But again, some research psychologists find this idea more interesting than it actually is. All right, I'm gonna skip through this because again, y'all did great with those. So in our last 3 or so minutes here, I want to talk about school violence. Maybe one of the only good side effects of the pandemic is that school shootings have gone down because the kids aren't in schools, right? So even if we don't think of school shootings, we know that bullying and other types of violence are unfortunately pretty common. So if we go back to, there was an old study in 99, 2000, 71% of students at that time in public schools reported experiencing one or more violent incidents. And 20% reported serious violent incidents. So those include rape, physical assault with a weapon, robbery, that type of thing. And 70% of high school students said they carried a gun. And in a little bit later study in 2005, 17% of public schools experienced at least one serious violent incident at their school. And we do see it, unfortunately, again, with younger schools sometimes as well. So who are these people who are school shooters? So some common characteristics that we see is that they have a lot of exposure to firearms, and they have a fascination with guns. So you can have exposure to firearms in your house and be like, whatever, right? But they have a fascination. They tend to be isolated or rejected by classmates. They're preoccupied with various forms of graphically violent media. Now, this does not mean that video games cause them to do this, right? But what it means is they might be particularly attracted to that, or that they might have difficulty distinguishing between reality, right, and video games. Also internet sites, music, that type of thing. They might have been teased. Assailants tend to be either frail or somewhat obese. They have a history of angry brooding, often with perceived status as social outcasts. So the incels, right, really fall into this. And developed a detailed plan often. So again, it's not spontaneous. We're thinking like Dexter is, we're planning. So possible school reforms people have talked about. Everyone always says, oh, put more security officers in there. But at Parkland, the security officer just like left, right? So that's not necessarily going to do it. The idea of school uniforms maybe decreasing class issues. Passing tougher gun laws, right? Would be really helpful, but you know. violence prevention programs. Some people argue we should resist access to violent media. I don't know that that's going to help. I think it's just going to make kids more interested, right? And some people argue that we should profile kids to try to identify those. That gets sketchy, right? Zero tolerance policies are ineffective and have the potential to stigmatize and harm individuals. Threat assessment holds more promise. It involves carefully considering the nature of the threat, the risk posed by the individual, and the need to respond to them. So for example, real quick, I know we're out of time here, but the Virginia Tech killer shooter, he actually was seeing a psychologist and she tried to get the school to pay attention and they kind of ignored her. And so since then, schools have taken this idea much more seriously. There are interdisciplinary teams that work together to deal with these things. So for example, nothing violent, but I had a student a few years, well, more than a few years back now, but who, just wasn't acting like himself. And I kind of reached out to the counselors and they said, oh, he's already on our radar, meaning like they kind of knew. And it turned out he was just developing bipolar disorder and having his first manic episode. So, alrighty. So thanks for hanging in with me while we finish that. And so next week we'll dive into our next topic. And I hope that everyone has a great weekend. I'll do my normal thing and stick around a little bit in case anyone has questions. Then I mute myself. I went to say you're muted, and then I muted myself, which is helpful.
The CASA